anything the last 5 years have shown us, it's that gender equity is required in all sectors, but especially in agriculture. In ag, we have to achieve gender equity and access to so many different kinds of resources: finance, education, healthcare, reproductive services for women. Women need access to markets, entrepreneurial training, and all kinds of empowerment to increase their personal agency. The UN Food Systems Summit actions and the Committee on Food Security's voluntary guidelines on gender all focused on the importance of ground-level action, as well as improved policy. In this session, we're going to be examining what's working and the actions that are needed to, again, scale these projects and activities in all of the critical areas I just mentioned. It's going to take everyone: the UN system, donors, multilateral organizations, private sector, the international research institutions, and non-governmental organizations all have to focus on joint action. Today, our speakers are going to touch on women's involvement in the agricultural economy, how it bolsters equitable livelihoods for everyone, which is so needed now in the disproportionate impacts we've seen from COVID on women and girls. We'll focus also on promoting the agency of the most historically disenfranchised populations. This is especially women in rural areas who are working so hard to improve the lives and livelihoods of everyone. We'll also focus on those policy and private sector innovations that are needed, especially in the area of finance, to help women-based agribusiness. We'll spotlight innovations on women's empowerment and rights, access to market, et cetera, and the important role of men in accelerating the progress for women and girls. I am so honored to have before you a panel of 9 wonderful speakers. I'm going to introduce them one by one. Shekhar Badsavli. He is a founder of Saguna Rural Foundation. Welcome, Shekhar.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And good morning. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Beth Dunford is the Vice President of Agriculture, Human Development, and Social Development at the African Development Bank.
Thank you.
Hi,
Good
Beth.
morning.
Yes, thank you for being here.
Glad to be here. I wish we were there in person, but it's nice to be here.
I know. We're going to get there. Sachi Gurumayum. He's the head of business development at Agbatech, as well as co-founder of Malkeki. Welcome, Sachi. So good to have you.
Thank you, Barbara. Hello to everyone. Good to be here.
Chris Hagedorn is the secretary for the Committee on Food Security. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Am I unmuted? There we go. Yeah, great to be here too, and especially with this caliber of panelists. So thank you, and hi to my friend Jocelyn and others.
Good to see you. Nabiha Hutchins is the CEO of PAI. Welcome, Nabiha.
Hello, all. Thank you so much, Barbara, for convening this, and great to be here.
And Jemima Njuki. She's Director for Africa at the International Food Policy Research Institute.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
Welcome from Nairobi. And Janie Sims-Hip is now General Counsel for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Congratulations, Janie, and welcome.
Thank you, and it's great to be with everyone today, and greetings from the USDA.
We also have in person Gareth Johnstone. He's Director General of World Fish. Welcome.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to be here in person. Fantastic.
It is, yes. And Jocelyn Brown Hall is our new director for the Office of North America for FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization. Welcome, Jocelyn.
Thank you, Barbara. It's a delight to be here.
So we are going to get started, and we're going to ask Jemima. Dr. Njuki, please frame this discussion for us.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'm delighted to be here today, especially as we celebrate the work of a remarkable woman, my sister and CGIAR colleague, Dr. Shakuntala Billstead. I will share a few broad thoughts to tee up the ensuing discussion with my great colleagues and friends on the panel. Now, a lot of these thoughts have been shaped by my learnings over the last 20 years working on gender equality and agriculture, but they are also shaped most recently with by women from around the world that we have engaged as part of the UN Food Systems Summit, but also the work we are doing within the CGIAR. Now, as we all know, while women are already engaged in multiple ways across the food systems as producers, as consumers, as processors, as traders, and have done so for millennia, actually, their work has been invisible for two main reasons: that our current food systems are inequitable. They perpetuate gender inequalities that are further shaped and reinforced by contextual gender and social, but also our food systems, resources, opportunities, and benefits are not equitably available to men and women. And as we have seen, given the rising hunger, malnutrition compounded by COVID-19, the call today really from this roundtable is for bold and a total shift in approach if we are to achieve systemic change. I will share with you some 4 domains of change that I believe must happen and happen together for us to achieve gender-just food systems. One is expanding women's voice, agency, and leadership in food systems. We need to guarantee the right of women to occupy their space in our food systems. In collaboration with Global Health 50/50, the CGIAR launched the Global Food 50/50. It is a global index and mechanism to monitor and hold food systems institutions accountable for gender equality in their leadership, in their workplace policies, and their outcomes. Now, we launched the inaugural report a couple of weeks ago, and this report shows that only 6% of the leaders of 52 food systems organizations are women from low and middle income countries. We must change this because women's voice and leadership is needed, and it must be visible all the way from the grassroots to boardrooms, to labs, to parliaments. 2 is increasing access and rights to resources and services that women need to engage and benefit from food systems. But if there is a place where we need to shift our thinking, it is here. We must shift how we think about resources and rights. For example, in financial inclusion, we often work with women to make them bankable. We must shift this thinking and make financial inclusion womenable. We cannot continue asking women to do the work when they are already doing it. We need financial institutions that are actually committed to design and deliver transformative financial services. And I am glad that the AFDB is here to tell us how they're doing that. 3 is overarching all this. We must change policies and institutions so that they work for women. As part of the UN Food Systems Summit, we made a call to governments, and we started seeing this in their national food systems transformation pathways, for them to adopt feminist food systems policies that are hinged on addressing the needs and priorities of women, to adopt gender-responsive budgeting, and to actually have clear gender outcomes. We cannot leave the job of gender equality only to the ministries of gender. And 4 and last is addressing the underlying causes of gender inequalities, including harmful gender and social norms. Norms about what women can and cannot be, what they can or cannot own, where they can go or not go. These continue to limit women's ability to exercise their agency. And I hope we can talk a bit about that too in the panel. In closing, I know we have made a lot of progress, but we must ensure that food systems work for women as much as women are working for food systems. Without addressing gender inequality, we know and we have the evidence that shows our sustainable development goals will remain that, goals, and not reality. So thank you, Barbara, so much. And I'm really looking forward to a deeper engagement on some of these priority domains of action that we know we must tackle.
Thank you, Jemima, for highlighting those 4 areas. They are so crucial. And I love the statement. We need to work for women as hard as they're working for us. Now we're going to go into a question and a bit of discussion on what really is most needed to effectively scale these strategies for women in agriculture. There's so much going on. So much emerged out of the UN Food Systems Summit. We have recommendations in reports and action being taken all over. What is most needed? Gareth, you've been working in this field for so long. You've been advocating for women. Give us some of your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Barbara, and thanks for the introduction there. The gender equality and women empowerment, remember, is one of the 4 levers for change that was identified in the UN Food Systems Summit, alongside human rights, innovation, and finance. So these levers are really critically important in terms of unlocking the significant progress we're making in terms of global call to action for sustainable food systems transformation and attaining the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So moreover, aquatic foods, which is the focus of research and innovation of World Fish, the organization that I represent and lead, is identified as one of the 7 priorities in terms of the UN food systems to end hunger and malnutrition and to protect the planet. So gender equality and women's empowerment are key impact areas for us. Over the past decades, our scientists at World Fish have studied and pioneered many gender transformative approaches and strategies, not only that are relevant to aquatic foods, but they're also relevant in terms of the wider agricultural development agenda. Now, I have 5 areas that I'd like to highlight in this respect that I think is really critical. Remember, in aquatic foods, 1 in every 2 workers are women. Women work directly in aquatic food production, but moreover in fisheries and aquaculture, but moreover, majority of workers in the other value chain activities related to development, processing, marketing, selling of fish, and other aquatic-based foods in terms of services and products. Women provide the labour, innovative ideas, entrepreneurship, which is mainly invisible in many aspects. And so my first point is it's very important that we capture, document, describe, and formally recognise the women's social and economic contribution by gathering the right data. Really important for even for budgeting, to understand not only in terms of production, but in terms of the distribution and the role that women play across the whole food system. And this data is necessary in terms of guiding food systems policies, innovations, investments that we're going to be talking about, ensuring that they are designed in terms of women's needs, aspirations, and experiences. I can provide examples of where we're working with, for example, with the FAO and the Duke University on illuminating hidden harvests, which is understanding the role of women across the whole spectrum of activities around small-scale fisheries.
I'm not going to believe it, but it's 1 more minute.
Empowerment of women. The second point I'd make is about empowerment of women in terms of financing, women-led innovations. I would also prioritise women's needs and voices, as been mentioned previously, particularly in the current COVID pandemic, and really tackling some of the issues that really set back gender equality. My 4th point, I'd say, is that men need to be better allies to attest for the quest for gender equality and women's empowerment, both in the workplace, but also at home as well. And finally, I'd like to say that we need more women in science. We need more women in science. 2015, UNESCO published an article that said 28% of researchers around the world are women. Simply not good enough. We need women to be in science, collecting that data, and making sure that we have real-world understanding of the problems and the issues facing by women across the food systems and so on. I got my 5 points in.
You did. Thank you.
Thank you for
excellent. And 28% of women are researchers. Oh my gosh, we know how we need to grow the research community, and gender equality there is absolutely crucial. Jocelyn, we're going to stay with our in-person speakers today. And Jocelyn, your thoughts?
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. And Gareth, you really stole some of my talking points, but I'll try to build on what you've said. First of all, I think we've come a long way. I have been in agriculture and the food security field for over 25 years. When I first came back from overseas, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Peshawar, Pakistan. I came back to the United States to get a job in agriculture and food security, and I was specifically interested in women. And so people said to me, and I'm afraid to say this, and the U.S. government said, well, women in development, that's a dead issue. We're over that. We don't need that anymore. And meanwhile, I would go into meetings and I would be the only woman in the meeting, and there would be 20 people in the meeting. So we've come a long way with the UN Food System Summit, where now gender and gender issues and women's empowerment are one of the 5 levers. And, I think we've made huge strides. However, we have a lot more to do. And I want to build on some things that Gareth talked about. First of all, women's empowerment and positive feedback. Barbara, I cannot thank you enough, and I'm so grateful that you've chosen Shakuntala Tilsted this year, a woman involved in aquaculture, a woman of color, a woman from Asia. She's going to be a role model for so many people, myself included, even though I don't fit some of those categories. So 1, we need more role models. 2, Gareth, the data and the feedback, so important to collect this data and statistics. We're focusing on it in FAO. We have a global campaign for Indigenous Women's Empowerment report that focuses on Indigenous women's, which is yet another area and yet another frontier that we really need more data and statistics about. We need to have women to have access to this data. I've just returned from Africa, where I served as FAO's representative to both Zimbabwe and Ghana. And, the data is out there, but women don't have access to it. And oftentimes they're not allowed to have access to it. We've got to just break those barriers down. And finally, and I hope we hear about this more from our other panelists, talking about the term global for women. So we need these global overarching ideas that come down from the UN Food System Summit that are top down, that show the leaders, show the citizens of the world that the leaders are emphasizing this, but we also need local solutions. Not everything is going to work for every different community in this area. And I'll go back to some really interesting work that FAO is doing in the indigenous peoples. We had a talk yesterday from an elder and a policy advocate, Ken Paul, who talked about how the women in his First Nation in Canada are the real drivers. The men happen to be the spokespersons, and that's how they divide up the advocacy for women. But there's no one size fits all for women. We've got an enormous diversity, and we need to embrace that. So those would be my 4 additions for you. And I also just want to make a final quote that yesterday I was so delighted to hear, and building off what Gareth said about women and agriculture and science. Your Borlaug Field Award moderator yesterday, Aditi Mukherjee, stated that there weren't that many women in science before, but now 10 years later, she feels like she's got more people around her. And I just can't emphasize enough how much we've got to change this paradigm. Thank you.
It is gratifying to see, and I think 5 out of our 10 Borlaug Field Award winners are women. And 2 were initially. So it is wonderful to see the progress, and there is so much more work to do. We're getting a bit of a theme about local solutions. As things proceed, we have to get to the ground and be sure that we're applying across different regions of the world the kinds of solutions that fit. And I know many of our speakers coming forward have more to say about that. But let's go now to our virtual speakers. Nabiha Hutchins, offer us some of your opening remarks on this.
Thank you, Barbara, and it's so great to be here. As you know, my father worked for Dr. Borlaug for almost 30 years at CIMMYT in Mexico, so it's always so special to be part of the dialogue, and look forward to joining you back in person at some point. We know about COVID, right? We know about COVID, how it's had a disproportionate impact on women and girls, and we know the results. There is more food insecurity. We're seeing increased gender-based violence, reduced access to essential health services, including reproductive health services, and I can go on and on. But I think it's really important to underscore that this is not just a set of outcomes that it's occurred because of COVID-19. I think it's hard-pressed to find a global challenge that doesn't disproportionately affect women and girls. And this year, yes, we had 2 big global moments. One was the UN Food System Summit, and then the other was the Generation Equality Forum. And what stands out is that in both of these gatherings, they certainly centered around rights and the power of people, and also local systems and solutions that will enable equitable livelihoods, empowered communities, and also resilience. And I always say that for any system to be resilient and equitable, it needs people. And if we are to take that further, whatever that system is, whether it's a food system or a health system or a political system, it needs to work for women, but also women need to be powering them. So as we look at the systems being powered by women, I think one thing that is so fundamental is that we need to stop piecemealing the needs and the rights of women and do away with an approach where others, and oftentimes it's men in leadership positions and control positions, that are deciding what healthcare do women get to have? What healthcare do they not get to have? What programs are good for rural women? But then these rural women are not at the table to shape these policies and programs. What rights should women have and what rights shouldn't they have? So, to your original question on what is it going to take to scale up the most effective strategies for women in agriculture, of course, the ag DNA that runs through my blood would say access to credit and capital and land ownership, access to quality inputs and seed and markets and more. And those are really important. We certainly have gone a very long way in those regards, but we haven't made it the entire way. And so I think that the most effective strategies for women in agriculture really requires a comprehensive approach that's going to promote, propel, and protect the agency, autonomy, and rights of women. Women and youth should not have to jump through hoops to access family planning and contraception services if they want it. This is a personal decision, right? To improve nutrition outcomes of children, women shouldn't be limited to a handful of options in the food basket that doesn't actually meet the taste and preferences of her family. I always say providing food and nourishment is an act of love, and we can't forget that. And this aspiration of empowerment and gender equality, it requires a fundamental shift in our mindset, in our approach. And the final thing I want to just lift up is my organization, PAI, based here in DC, we're a civil society organization that is advocating alongside 96 of our civil society partners across 33 countries to ensure that communities have access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we are very, very clear that in order to achieve our mission and the aspirations of women's rights and global health, we have to power shift. And our model is entirely around power shifting, where local communities are deciding, where they're driving, and where they're sustaining. And we believe that when that happens, change is certain. Our approach to change is always through a lens of possibility, positivity, and strength, and not through an assumption of deficiency or insufficiency. We trust, we believe, we fund, we look at sustainable ways forward, and we get out of the way. So what's the solution? Ask women what they need, what they want, and how you can help, and then meet them where they are and they want to go.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nabiha. What a great depiction, not only of a whole range of work that's needed, but the appeal for a comprehensive approach, not a piecemeal approach, and where the women get to decide. Yep. So I'm standing here as a woman saying I support that. So let's just take a minute or two. If one or two others, we can go to our gallery view and just see if anybody else has comments that they'd like to make. We need to convert ours to gallery view so we can see. Anybody have any one thing that they might like to add, a follow-on comment? We've heard some great propositions of areas for action. If not, we can move on to our next question. Great. We are going to move on and talk about historically disenfranchised populations. And Janie Sims-Hip, you are the perfect person to launch us into this discussion. Women in rural areas and developing countries here in the U.S., you've worked with Native American populations for years. Please, what kinds of progress do you see that's needed, and what is the role for men?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me and having me participate today, and greetings to everyone there in Iowa, and greetings to my own secretary, Bill Sack. I think he's there with you this week. Let me just start by saying that in my current role as general counsel at USDA, I'm the first Native woman to hold this position within the department. And I have worked at USDA before, and I'm so honored to be back, but I'm also back to a USDA that looks quite different than what it did before. We have Secretary Vilsack back, but we also have Dr. Jewel Bernal, the first African-American woman to serve as Deputy Secretary of USDA. So I cannot tell you how proud I am to be a part of this team. And we have lots of pillars of work that we're involved in at USDA. Many impacts that we're making across the globe, obviously, and some of you have run into the Secretary and the Deputy in various settings over the last several months since we've come on board. But one of the areas that I obviously, Barbara, held near and dear to my heart is the work that we're doing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. This is a renewed effort of this Biden-Harris administration, I might add, and we are rolling up our sleeves. I actually, just within the General Counsel's office, have emboldened my staff to have an Indian law working group, which is going to examine some of the legal frameworks that sit up around Indigenous access to land and resources in the U.S., but I've also asked that same group to broaden their scope and pull in an examination of the barriers, and some of them are even beyond barriers. They're systemic systems that have been embedded in our policies for so long that have created almost insurmountable abilities for people to access our programs because they're just designed poorly. To meet the needs of gender issues as well as disenfranchised populations. So we are within the General Counsel office itself really taking a deep dive into the policy frameworks. But I just have to tell you that's just a part of the work. That's just within my own office. We have teams around USDA that are tackling these issues just as deeply as we can push into that space. But let me give you an example of the role of Indigenous women in U.S. agriculture. Indigenous communities held the land of the United States in total for tens of thousands of years. We now farm and ranch on about 50 to 60 million acres of land. And if you look at the data, and I'm so glad someone brought up data, it's so terribly important. Native women make up over half of all Indigenous farmers and ranchers, but we are totally invisible in the conversation. And that's one of the things that I want to bring home to everyone. I think everyone on the panels has already said it, but I'm going to say it again. We have to be visible. We have to be in leadership roles because it matters that we're not the only ones in the room. We must, as policymakers, really see the issues from the eyes of the people that are being disenfranchised and have been for so long, including gender-based issues. Men have a huge role to play as allies, but we've got to do the deep work of tackling financial systems, policy systems, access to resources, access to land, access to infrastructure. That often is, kind of nebulous, but it's really, really important. I just will tell you that I'm going to cede the rest of my time to everyone else. There's so much to say in this space, but I'm thrilled to be with you and just let you know that USDA is deep in the weeds of this important work. Thanks.
Thank you. Just so wonderful to hear all that perspective and that commitment. It's so important. We need to see that leadership really in all governments. So we'll be looking for that across the world. Chris, you're coming to us from Rome. Thank you so much. The CFS issued voluntary guidelines on gender equality this year, but what are some of your reflections on particularly these inequities?
Well, first, Barbara, thank you for the invite and thank you for helping. Last week, we had a very successful 49th plenary session here in Rome, held virtually. Barbara helped manage one of our discussions around follow-up to the Food Systems Summit. I'd also like to thank Janie for the work she's working on, and everybody else, Secretary Vilsack on down from USDA. My very first job in the executive branch was working as a policy analyst in the WIC program. And so that was 30 something years ago, and it stuck with me this whole time, the importance of getting nutrition right, getting gender issues right, taking care of the most vulnerable. And so it's a great topic. We are working now on voluntary guidelines. In fact, today we're having a regional consultation in Africa. We've already had regional consultations in Latin America and in Europe, but this is part of what the CFS is working on in this particular area, along with many others. But let me tell you, CFS is still outside of Rome, and particularly in the US. A lot of people don't know what the CFS is. It's the UN's Rome-based Committee on World Food Security, which since 2009 has been providing policy convergence, advice, frameworks, guidance on food security and nutrition issues. The full range and complexity of food systems are captured, negotiated based on scientific reports of our CFS high-level panel of experts. And since 2009, we have, building on the voluntary guidelines for the progressive realization of the right to food, a very key foundation stone for us, we've developed voluntary guidelines on land tenure, principles for responsible agriculture investments, a framework on protracted crises, and just this year, voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition, as well as policy recommendations on agroecological and other innovative approaches to food security and nutrition. So we've been busy, and hopefully in the US, more people will read those, both the HLP reports and the products that we promulgate. So our advisory group, we have 133 member states. So this is the most inclusive UN intergovernmental body for food security and nutrition. And the advisors consist of UN agencies, UN Nutrition, the CGIAR, the World Bank, Gates Foundation, Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, and self-governing mechanisms of civil society and the private sector. We report to the UN General Assembly via ECOSOC and the FAO conference. So on today's conversation on gender, as I said, we're working to develop voluntary guidelines. Those we anticipate negotiating next year in the spring and summer, and finalizing and adopting at CFS 50 in October. So we are collecting regional inputs that give the full scope, complexity, the particular views and perspectives of the various regions. And those will help shape the negotiated document, the first draft, which we will, and I'll put it in the chat where you can find all this. But this is exactly addressing the wide spectrum of issues that other speakers have already talked about, the hurdles for women and girls in particular that negatively impact our ability collectively to achieve the SDGs, particularly SDG 2. So we all know women are essential to producing our food, to feeding our infants and families, to investing in sustainable food systems to protect our soils, water, and biodiversity. Yet they're consistently underrepresented in decision-making at the core, on the core issues that directly impact them. They need to be included at the decision at the tables where very completely with my predecessor. Too often they don't have access to land, to capital, to the resources necessary to thrive. They often live in poverty, suffer the harshest impacts of climate change, and their agency and rights are either not respected or sometimes not even recognized. So this must change, and all of us are responsible for raising these issues in our governments, our communities, our mosques, our churches, our temples, even within our own families. So join us on this issue.
You can wind up.
I'm just saying goodbye and thank you, and that's just come and join us. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you. It's really great to hear what the UN is doing, the broad reach, the regional dialogues, the guidelines themselves, and to know action, the detailed action in the report I know is also really well spelled out. So Great to hear all of that. And Njuki, Jemima, we're going to come to you for a bit more on this, following on what you said earlier.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I think one of the things that I have seen, and especially as I've worked across Africa and Asia, is the power of women organizing and especially marginalized women. You know, from the self-help groups in India to village savings and loans associations across Africa. And we need to support these women organizing. I've seen, for example, the Self-Employed Women's Association really bring to the front line the issues of informal workers, the work in the food system, integrating them into global value chains, but also really being part of a voice for women at the global level. And I think we really need to make a very intentional effort to support grassroots organizations. I want to talk a bit about, you know, the role of men, because even as women organize, even as they play their roles in the food system, we cannot leave the job of achieving gender equality on women. We cannot put the burden on getting to equality to those who are most affected by inequality. I think this has to shift fundamentally. And there's such a critical role for men to play as leaders, as husbands, as fathers, as friends, as allies. And I just want to mention 3 key areas where I think this is really important. Men who are in leadership positions, to ensure that they are gender responsive, they're transformational in the things that they do, that the things they design, whether it's infrastructure, meets the needs and priorities of women. In Kenya, early this year, we had one of the governors in one of our counties actually build the biggest rural market and include childcare facilities in that rural market. So imagine if those that are designing infrastructure respond to some of these needs and priorities. This allows women to actually engage in economic activity without having to worry about where their children are. The second group is the men who are in traditional and cultural leadership roles. I see that so critical in Africa, where a lot of our land is still under customary laws, that they ensure that women have equal ownership and rights during their allocation of land, but also ensure that the traditional laws, customs, and practices that they oversee actually guarantee the rights and dignity of women and girls. I've seen traditional leaders in Mali say 30% of the land we allocate as customary landholders is going to go to women. So this is really, really powerful. But also men in households engaging in equitable decision-making, recognizing the women, hearing the voices of women, and making sure that there is equitable decision-making, the sharing of unpaid care work, that the burden is actually shifting to be much more shared. But more generally, making sure that women are creating the spaces, the men create the spaces for women's voices and leadership in the food system spaces that they currently dominate, even as we expand to get more women into these spaces.
Thank you so much, Jemima. Excellent points, and I appreciate you bringing us back to the grassroots work that's needed and following those actions and the 3 different levels of responsibility that men have as well in leadership, cultural leadership, and also in households. So much more to be done really at all levels. Anybody have one quick follow-on comment they might like to make on this particular topic? You can just raise your actual hand. Yes. Sati.
Thank you, Barbara. I was just going to say that rhymes so well. I mean, when Jemima said leadership from men need to drive change, I've also been thinking about how in many societies, and this might also rhyme with what Janie said earlier, women might be visible in the workforce, but that doesn't necessarily translate into equal rights. And that's something that we do need to address and think about more seriously in our design process.
Excellent point. Any other last quick point? Yes, Nabiha.
So I'm just going to build on what Sachi said, that certainly equal rights, but I want to make sure that we're also looking at this from an equity perspective, because that then informs where the heavier investments are needed and where greater access to whatever the programs might be and interventions might be can reap the benefits in an equitable way. But all great points.
Yes. Janie, your last thought.
Just a very quick add-on. As we're really digging deeply into the policies and the laws that sit up under these issues, if we don't have the women's words at the table and their brains and the disenfranchised communities at the table, then we do not have all the information we need to actually fundamentally shift those words on the piece of paper that literally drive policy. And that is hard work. But I think it's very important that we have everyone at the table, because we will not hear from them if we do not know them.
Thank you. Well said. We will not hear from them if we do not hear them.
If we don't know them, if we can't see them, then we cannot hear from them.
Exactly.
Yes.
Thank you. We're going to shift our focus and topic now significantly and talk specifically about finance and investment. We know that policy level and private sector innovations are proceeding. There is a need to increase financial opportunities for women-based agribusiness all over the world. It needs to be localized. It needs to be specific to the regions of the world. How can we build on some of the experience and programs that we know are out there addressing innovations for women's empowerment and rights in their access to markets and finance in the ag sector, and what more needs to be done? We have three speakers that are really anxious to address this issue specifically. Sachi?
Thank you, Barbara. Great so far. I mean, what I'd like to say is, just continuing on the topics raised earlier by my fellow panelists. I mean, I would like to address financing in three themes. I think the money's out there. It's a question of how do you make sure that women find access, but also are prepared to have that access and make good use of the money. Now, I said three themes. The first one is, and I think it goes well with what we just discussed, is gender-sensitive design with an inclusive mindset from the very beginning. So you design a program with equality in mind, with equity in mind, and you say, how are we going to implement this? I can give you an example. Lady Agri, the group that I am an advisor to, has been working with Robusta coffee growers in multiple countries, and they're doing that with a focus on smallholder women farmers. But then they're also thinking about what is it that women need specifically. And if you think about, safety during pregnancy, for example, so women need loans to get access to labor to help them manage their land, their crop during times of need. At the same time, if they need labor to do the manual work, they need to be able to access that. So design it in such a way. I mean, my own organization, the Malkeki Foundation, back in Manipur in India, when we were training farmers at crossroads, just waiting for them to show up at our info session, we found it really hard to get farmers to come on their own until we included a nurse in the group. And suddenly the nurse started talking to the woman, and women suddenly showed a lot of interest in their own personal health. And then they dragged the men along, and suddenly we had all these farmers, men and women, attending our info sessions. Now, the second point is around the design, and then the second point is around policy. Now, policies take multiple stakeholders to be involved, takes time, it takes government championship and so on. But then while we are working on the policy, what is it that we're going to do to fill the gap? So if we say financing for women, equitable financing for women and equal access, that's not going to happen from a policy level today, tomorrow. It might be a mid to long-term exercise. But then there are organizations like the Microloan Foundation who are working not on a collateral basis, but by vetting them well, by training them well, and organizing loan, grantees in such a way that they get their loans repaid on time. And I think they have a success rate of 98, 99%. The last point is around capacity building. We touched on this earlier on. Over the last years and decades, women have been left behind. And this is visible in the statistics, talking about data. Women-owned farm, I think, generally are 40-50% lower in productivity. So we need to ask ourselves why, and how do we address that? And that comes from, again, designing, specific programs that are targeting skill sets, uplifting for women. An example coming, to a specific on-the-ground example is this recent partnership between Cargill, the major trading organization, and Lady Agri in central Cameroon to train up to 3,000 farmers in their cocoa growing community. So they're growing cocoa already, but what if you could train the women in the communities to also grow seasonal cash food crops that they could sell and earn? That empowers them. Empowering a woman, simultaneously addresses a lot of issues in the family, including child labor, deforestation. I mean, there are many reasons why we should be working on gender equality and equitable livelihoods. So I'll pause at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sachi. I appreciate you referencing that. The work of Lady Agri was featured in a workshop yesterday, and you could see all of those aspects being addressed in the inclusive design, filling the gaps in that policy change until you get there, and the capacity building that's needed. So very important components, and great to hear what's going on the ground to try to address some of those. Beth, you've been waiting. You've got a tremendous portfolio at the African Development Bank. Tell us more on finance and investment.
Great. Well, thank you, Barbara. And really, thank you for inviting the African Development Bank to return to the Borlaug dialogue. And I'm really proud to be part of an institution that holds agriculture really close at our heart. And of course, can claim as one of our own, the World Food Prize laureate, Banku president, Dr. Adesina. So the bank is strengthening women-led agribusiness and access to financing, advisory services to foster entrepreneurship and agribusiness on many levels. So for decades, we've really, of course, been talking about the huge contribution that African women make to food systems, but they don't have the same level of access to inputs as men do, which is really important. So the Africa Gender Index says that only 23% of women have access to credit. And we all know that lack of access to financing often, especially for farmers, keep women trapped in poverty and subsistence farming. And this is especially true with increased climate impacts. So the financing gap for African women in agriculture, the value chains writ large, is estimated at $15.6 billion. And so in my experience, when women have access to finance, markets, technologies, food systems are more inclusive, and the global hunger gap can be narrowed. So what is the African Development Bank doing? The gender strategy of the bank focuses on women's access to finance, markets, skills development, access to social services. And so we're doing this to really build infrastructure and with a focus on sectors where women have high entrepreneurial potential. And agriculture, of course, is key to that. So one of our flagship programs is the Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation Initiative, also known as TAT. And this aims to accelerate the doubling of crop, livestock, and fish productivity, expanding access to proven climate-smart technologies to over 40 million people. And this has really important parts of it that gender-sensitive reform of national and regional policy in technology delivery, as well as for commodity value chain, seed releases, accesses to fertilizer. So we're already really seeing some positive changes in the lives of women farmers, to increase food security and income because of some of these issues. So, in Kenya, just to provide one example, a maize grower named Doreen Atamo is one of more than 770,000 farmers who now have access to climate-smart certified maize seed. So this is increasing yields by 30%, and this is really helping farmers earn money for things that they need. And many of these farmers are women. So I also want to talk about the affirmative action. I just lost my paper here. I'd also like to really talk about another flagship that we have, which is the Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa initiative, or as we like to call it, AFAWA. And it aims to reduce the $42 billion financing gap that women businesses face on the continent. And we aim to facilitate up to $5 billion of financing to women-led businesses. So importantly, one important part of this AFAWA effort is a risk-sharing instrument, and that's to unlock credit to women businesses and enterprises in Africa. And so this mechanism builds upon the existing network of commercial banks and microfinance institutions to create the structural change and lasting impact that women really need. So this is accompanied with technical assistance to help women become bankable, help them improve their businesses, their business development services, their business plans, their accounting systems, their financial systems, so they can access finance. But as Jemima said earlier, we don't just want to make women bankable. We want to make banks womenable. And I really, really like how you phrase that. So this technical assistance is also for financial institutions to help them design products, financial products for women that are really specific to their needs and their particular circumstances. So this credit line is also going to use a grading system to evaluate financial institutions based on the share and quality of their lending to women and the socioeconomic impact of this lending. So top institutions will be rewarded with preferential financial terms from the African Development Bank. So I feel like that's the kind of action we need to make financial institutions womenable, as we said. So again, really looking forward to hearing the rest of this discussion and the impact we can make together on women's finance. Thank you.
Okay, I know we're going to take that one forward, making financial institutions womenable. Thank you. Thank you for all of that perspective. Isn't it incredible how much is going on? I mean, maybe we're actually going to really start seeing the needle move in these important areas and progress on all fronts. Shekhar, you are going to bring us down to the ground, I think, for some really amazing work going on in your region.
Yeah. I wanted to tell that in Indian conditions, the equitable livelihood, how it works in our condition through agro-rural tourism. So to get the spark of equitable livelihood in the minds of agrarian women in rural India, they first need to get the proper feeling of dignity. It is a psychological process through which they can get confidence. Rural Indian women have been historically...
Sorry, Shekhar, I'm going to ask you to pause a moment. We have an interruption. Sorry about that. Okay, continue.
Okay, yeah. So rural Indian women have been historically disenfranchised by society, and on top of this, overloaded by agrarian duties. Due to this, they are unable to even imagine that there can be a different lifestyle than a misery many such women live through daily. Even after a great deal of efforts and money spent by Indian government, local and international NGOs, and individuals with a progressive mindset, achieving these big objectives are long distance away. To accelerate the progress of women and girls in rural parts of developing world, we need to have a different way, an atypical path which can produce a win-win outcome. This path is agro-rural tourism. We call it ART, A-R-T. We define ART as an activity organized by farmers on an active farm where leisurely learning and fun are combined together. ART was born on our farm in the small rural Indian village of Neral. It's a state of Maharashtra in 1985. Through ART, 12 to 15 disenfranchised women from our village received more dignity, were financially more empowered, and became an important part of village economy. Through agro-rural tourism, they felt much more important to the society. The city counterparts who imparted all this to these women received happiness by spending a day on the farm through leisurely learning about food production. This innovative activity is called as ART. I want to make a last comment. A spark of dignity and confidence can only be injected, can only be ignited by those who are dignified in the cities, by going to the farmer's farm, spending some money, purchasing available food items, and being able to find a new farmer friend. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shaker. And it's really incredible to hear a man working on behalf of women and women's empowerment in such a creative way. The idea of increasing dignity and confidence, it's so much part of that personal agency we're all talking about. So we can see if there's any one or two comments before we go into a final comment round from everyone. I know so many, it sparked so many comments. I'm sure there'd be so much to add, but anybody want to say anything in particular? We have a dog joining us. Oh, that's great. It wouldn't be Zoom if there wasn't an animal or a child involved. Yes, Jeannie.
I just want to quickly say that, Barbara, you know this about me. I actually started my legal career as a commercial litigator, so of financial instruments. And I have just been gripped over the last 30 years that our financial instruments are literally ill-equipped to face the future. And we're looking at that across USDA's financial, access to capital portfolio and trying to figure out exactly how we can, use the discretion we have or go to Congress and actually think about these things anew. But the reality is that I'm not sure, Barbara, that we share enough of what works across the world in these financial instrument spaces. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I refer to it as we don't have any ability to have an oops. 60 years ago, farmers were more known to people in the city. And we're so separated and isolated at this point that our financial systems that sit up underneath us don't consider that if we're going to stay out here farming and ranching, that we got to have long-term financial access.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Any other final? Yes, Jemima.
Yeah, I'm just struck by what Janie says, and one of the examples I always give is the funding for especially women who work in food systems is so out of sync with the kind of activities that they're engaged in. If you think about it, even from a very basic perspective, that a woman wants financial access to start a poultry business, and she starts with day-old chicks, and she gets a loan to buy day-old chicks, construct a house for them. But then the bank requires that at the end of that calendar month that she starts paying, and the chicks are just, I know, they are now 30 days. They're not laying eggs. They're not adults. It's just, some of it sounds so basic, but it still happens over and over again that we know the financial system isn't designing for food systems yet. And even worse, it's not designing for the women in food systems. So there's really a lot that needs to happen in that space, including all the way from the basics of how financial instruments are structured.
Shati, it seems you want to build on that.
Yeah, right. I just wanted to say, I think it's not just city dwellers we need on the farm. We need literally everyone who's involved in the system to come out and spend some time on the farm, to understand the dynamics of farm labor. How is it done? What are the risks? What are the potential opportunities? How much is the involvement of women? What is the necessity for safer biological inputs, for example? There are so many things that happen on the farm that people who are designing solutions have, I think, lost touch with. And that's something that maybe we can address through greater interactions between the communities.
We're hearing so many great recommendations, so much action that's needed. We know that women farmers are half the farmers, 1 out of 2 around the world, and especially smallholders. And without dealing with some of the inequities that we've all been talking about, we're just not going to see progress in agricultural fields that we need to around the world. So we want to turn to an opportunity for a last word from each of you. Just one or 1.5 minutes of your final thoughts that you'd like to leave this broad community with that's listening in today. So I'm just going to take volunteers. If you want to raise your hand, anybody want to start us off? Gareth?
Thanks, Barbara. And it's been a really stimulating discussion and raised many questions in my mind as well about how we can move this forward. I think one of them is around how we can look at either a gradual change or a step change. And one of the things that comes to my mind is a narrative, a refreshed narrative in communications about all that we do, because it's multifaceted from the farm through to policy, and how then can we create a narrative which is much more appealing for young scientists to come into institutions that I represent, appealing to change the mindsets of financial institutions. And I think there's opportunities that we haven't talked about communications. We also haven't talked about gender parity in the workplace, and so those issues in terms of finances. So it's stimulated a lot, and I think, my mind, what I think is that we need a new narrative, a fresh narrative that really tackles these issues and raises them to a much more strategic level, changes mindsets, increases the ability for investors to see the economic value of investing, but also the cultural value and so on and so forth. So that's what's resonating in my mind.
Fantastic. I mean, I think you'd have some takers here in trying to develop that narrative of change that has to happen. Who else would like to go? Janie, would you like to speak next?
Sure. And I always leave every conversation like this with the same thought. And I try to go to bed every night thinking this same thought. What are we doing today to tackle these issues so that our children and our grandchildren live in a better place? And many Indigenous women I work with around the U.S., we have that front of mind. I know many people on this panel have that front of mind, but we have some really important opportunities moving forward to really escalate the attention paid to these issues, but we have to be thinking about what our children and grandchildren will inherit. And many of these issues are long past needing to be fixed.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Jocelyn and then back to Chris.
Thank you, Barbara, so much. I'd like to build on something that Beth talked about, which was accountability in the second example that she talked about, where the financial institutions that were actually serving women more were praised more. So there's a carrot approach there. And I'm going to fold it into this idea of accountability for all of us. In FAO, each one of our projects, a $5,000 project, $30 million project has several gender-based monitoring and evaluation indicators in it. And we have to hold ourselves accountable. We need not just to get the data, but what are we going to do with that data? What does this tell us? And I just want to, we have to make sure that we don't just talk. Our Director General is big on walking the walk, and I think we all are in positions of authority here where we can do that. And I just want to make a plea to all of us to, not just say it with the words, but to continue to be accountable for them.
Great point. Chris, we'll come to you, and then Nabiha.
Thanks, Barbara. I think one of the things I'm probably most proud of with the CFS is, amongst its many products, is actually the platform that it represents and how inclusive it is. And I think as we see 150 or so countries who plan policy transition pathways in the coming year and years, I think if they recognize the importance of inclusive dialogue that includes those who don't have the power and don't have the advantages right now, make sure that those conversations include the most vulnerable and those who really are suffering the most. And certainly the voluntary guidelines on gender equality and women and girls empowerment, when they're adopted next year, will hopefully go a long way to help shaping those policy discussions and projects and programs that will come out of it. And the last thing, somebody brought up UNESCO and how important education is. And I just cannot, for my own daughter, for my own experience, educating girls is such a massive piece of the puzzle. For everything from their own healthcare, reproductive rights, but getting them involved in the STEM fields and just, involved in improving their own agency and control over their own destinies. So thank you again for the invite.
Absolutely. We've heard so much in our discussions around that, not only the need for making women more visible, but having that role at the table, at the decision-making table, inclusive from really all components. And it's so much work needs to be done to define those areas, the management roles to play, the leadership roles to play, the defining the narrative going forward, having the women define the narrative going forward. And of course, CFS has a very, very inclusive process, but there's a lot of inclusive dialogues going on around the world, and the Food Systems Summit included that. One of the things we didn't say, Jemima, was that you are representative, the special rapporteur, I think, or representative for gender equity in the Food Systems Summit. So we may come back around to you to reflect on that a little bit if we have some more time. But I think next in our queue, we were going to go to Nabiha and then Beth.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited about the fact that we've been talking about the intersectionality and linkages across issues, across systems, and women's lives. And that's a big takeaway for me, and I suspect for many of the panelists here. I think and Jemima lifted this up so beautifully, is we need to make sure that our food and our health systems aren't placing an undue burden on women and communities, and the importance of investments so that they're meeting women where they're at. For PAI, it's really critical, and we always do that, meeting communities where they're at, and making sure that the approach is not only fit for purpose, but also future-proof. And we also know that gains in SRHR are gains across a whole host of outcomes, and we have to approach it in a way that's equitable.
Just say, if you will, Nabiha, SRHR.
Yeah, sexual reproductive health and rights. Is the acronym for SRHR. And we know, right, when women have access, for example, to family planning, we have better nutrition outcomes in our households, better economic gains, and so on and so forth. So all of this is connected, and I just hope for greater cross-sectoral collaboration. We're all here to work together. How can we better leverage our dollars and investments so that they work in a multifaceted approach, because our lives are multifaceted. And a win for women is a win for communities.
Thank you. Beth?
Thanks. I just want to, I love this platform and that we're talking about this and we are sharing what's worked, because, there's so much to be done, and, we need to continue to learn from each other, and we need to continue to do more, right? We know that we need partnerships. We know that we need governments. We know that we need, civil society. We know that we need researchers. We need funders. We need banks. We need everybody to come together and work on this together. And so how we put those partnerships together in a way that really fuels action and, exponentially increases the impact that we have is something that we need to continue to get more creative about. And then like measurement and accountability, I think like Jocelyn said, like who are we reaching, and how are we holding everybody accountable for who they're reaching? And then lastly, what's the scale? I don't want to go to the field anymore and just meet women who don't have access to finance. I want to go and see, women who have access to finance. So are we reaching the scale that is at that critical mass that really shifts that transformation to really make financial institutions winnable, to really ensure that women have what they need to really transform their economies? Again, we haven't talked a lot about COVID-19, but as we're building back better, this is the chance to do it differently. And we can't do it unless we get it to the scale that we need for it to be impactful. So thank you.
And that's really a theme throughout our dialogue this week, is getting to scale. There's so much great work going on. It's all over the world in all parts of the agricultural sector. And we know we need to build on it and we need to accelerate the impact of it and get to scale for many of the projects that you all have referenced even today. So let's go perhaps to Shaker or to Shachi, and we're going to give you the last word, Jemima.
Yeah, I think in Indian condition scenario, the work needs to be taking place at grassroots level. And agrotourism is a perfect patio where city folks, people with power, men with power can come and interact with women who are working for agriculture. Women in agriculture in developing country like India, they really get a lot of battering, and they don't have a chance to express. They don't get a place to go and talk. So agrotourism is a place where they can start the action, and that's where the action can begin. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for calling in the middle of the night. I think you're calling in from Mumbai.
Yes.
Yes, we appreciate it. Shati.
Yes, thank you. All right. I am a bit reflective. I think we've spent, a good amount of time. We've heard a lot about high-level policies. We've learned a lot about on-the-ground activities. I am reflective in the sense that as I walk away from this, and I hope this is the same for everyone here, including the audience, as we walk away from this, what is it that I can do in my own capacity, in my own sphere, to make a difference today, tomorrow, and for future generations? I think I'll leave at that. But thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jemima?
Thank you so much, Barbara. This has been such a rich conversation. So a couple of things strike me that I want to finish with. One is, so I joined the CGIR about 20 years ago. And the conversation we are having today is the conversation we were having 20 years ago. The characters around the table have changed. We've got more men, for example, talking about gender equality, but really the conversation is the same. And I think it was Jamie who said, what is it that we bequeath our children and grandchildren? And I keep thinking that when I'm 70 and 80, how people going to be sitting around the table having the same conversation? Because I think we've got to make enough progress so that doesn't happen. And I have a couple of thoughts to it related to what a few people have said. First is the issue of scale. And so when I started this work, and over the years, there've been a lot of focus on what women can do, on what we want them to do better, on the skills and training and capacity that needs to happen, on the services that they need to get. And we've talked about that today. But for us to actually get to that tipping point of change, we've got to think about systemic change. We've got to think about the policies, the laws, the institutions, and how they're designed and how they function. Because that's the only way we're going to get to scale. We get enough banks like what Beth is doing. We get enough financial institutions that are designing for women, that are making sure their services are womenable. They know what their needs and priorities are, and we get to scale. We're not going to get to scale one woman at a time. There's half the population. It's 5 billion in a couple of years. So we've got to really think much more about how we remove the inequalities that exist at that systems level, at policy level. Imagine if every government around the world designed a food systems policy that was equitable, that was using gender responsive budgeting to allocate resources, that had clear gender outcomes that they are accountable to their citizens for. So I know it's a big ask, it's a big job, but to get to that scale, we need to make sure not just financial services are womenable, but extension services are womenable, policies are womenable. It's the whole scope of that institutional governance level that has to change. And then the last point I want to make, go ahead. Back to you, Barbara. I know but I did want to make one last point, because for all the people listening, we are all working in institutions, in organizations, whether they are research organizations. We've got to make sure that this space exists. We started the Global Food 50-50 as an outcome of the UN Food Systems Summit, where I had the pleasure of serving as custodian for gender equality and women's empowerment. And part of it was to really make sure that food systems organizations were accountable, not just in the work they do, but in the leadership and in their policies as well. Because we can't mirror externally what we don't have in our own spaces. If we don't have parity in our internal spaces, how is it going to happen? If FAO doesn't have parity internally, how are we going to make sure governments that we work with
Thank you. And I know it was great to hear from it. It was great to hear from Jocelyn from FAO about that accountability and how it has happened. Thank you. I just have to thank the entire panel, wonderful speakers. Really appreciate you being here, and really just great challenges put forward. There is no doubt that we will not achieve gender equity by 2030 or any time even beyond that if we are not accelerating the kinds of actions that you're talking about. Please stay tuned. Our next discussion is between our own Shakuntala Tilsted, her work empowering women and uplifting women economically and otherwise, and the president of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation new Gender Equality Division. So join us, click right in just shortly. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you.